The morning sun cast long shadows across Daniel Foster's withered cornfields, where blackened stalks stood like grave markers against the Nebraska sky. At 32, Don had weathered 5 harsh winters on this land, but nothing had prepared him for the devastation that stretched before him now. The locust swarm had passed 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a wasteland where his dreams of prosperity once grew. He knelt and picked up a handful of dry earth, letting it slip through his calloused fingers as he calculated the debts mounting like storm clouds on his horizon. Inside his modest farmhouse, Don stared at the stack of unpaid bills, scattered across his kitchen table like accusations. The banknote was due in 60 days, the seed money long since invested in crops that now fed only the memory of hungry insects. His neighbor's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes a man's got to swallow his pride to save his land. The coffee had grown cold in his cup as he watched dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight, each one a reminder of how quickly everything could turn to nothing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his reverie, and Don looked up to see Pastor William Henderson dismounting from his bay mare. The older man's weathered face carried the kind of determined optimism that had built churches and communities across the frontier. "Daniel," he called out, removing his hat as he approached the porch, "I've got something that might interest you. The church is organizing a community auction tomorrow, folks offering their skills and services to help neighbors in need." His eyes swept across the devastated fields with understanding compassion. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Pastor Henderson pulled a folded notice from his coat pocket, the paper still smelling of fresh ink from the church's printing press. "It's not charity, son. It's community. People bid on services: cooking, sewing, carpentry, even some of those newfangled agricultural ideas from back east." Dan's initial resistance melted as he read the notice, his desperate situation making the impossible seem suddenly practical. The pastor's next words would change everything. "There's a masked woman who's put her name down for agricultural solutions, and nobody knows who she is or what she's offering." The mystery sparked something in Dan's chest, a flutter of hope. He'd thought the locusts had devoured along with his crops. That evening, Don sat on his porch watching the sun set over his ruined fields, the pastor's words circling in his mind like vultures over carrion. $2, that's all he had left, after paying for his horse's feed and his own meager supper. The masked woman intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain, perhaps because mystery was the one thing his ordered, predictable life had always lacked. He thought of his late father's advice about taking chances when conventional wisdom failed, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel Foster allowed himself to imagine that tomorrow might bring something other than despair. The morning of the auction dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of October sky that made promises of good weather for the harvest that would never come. Don, dressed in his Sunday clothes, a blue cotton shirt his mother had sewn before her death, and trousers that had seen better days but were clean and pressed. As he hitched his horse to the wagon, his hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of betting his last $2 on a complete unknown. The ride to town felt like a journey to either salvation or final ruin. The wooden wheels marking time against the hard-packed earth. The Millfield Community Hall buzzed with the energy of neighbors gathering in crisis, their voices weaving together stories of shared hardship and stubborn hope. Don recognized most faces: the Kowalski family, who'd lost their barn to fire; Mrs. Chen, whose husband had taken ill during harvest; young Tommy Morrison, whose father had died in a logging accident. Pastor Henderson stood at the makeshift podium, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd married, buried, and counseled this community through every trial the frontier could deliver. The auction items ranged from practical to precious. Martha Stevens offered to bake pies for a month, while old Pete promised to repair anything with a broken wheel or loose nail. When the mysterious masked woman stepped forward, the hall fell silent with collective curiosity and speculation. She wore a simple gray dress that spoke of quality without ostentation, and her face was concealed by an elegant black silk mask that covered everything from her forehead to her nose, leaving only her determined mouth and strong jawline visible. "Agricultural Solutions," Pastor Henderson announced, reading from his list, "with a guarantee of improved crop yield using modern scientific methods." The bidding started at 50 cents, rose quickly to $1.50. But when Dan's voice rang out with $2, the room turned to stare at the desperate farmer who'd just wagered his last coins on a masked stranger's promise. His choice was made irrevocable as the fall of a hammer. After the auction concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Dawn approached the masked woman with the awkward courtesy of a man unaccustomed to business dealings with mysterious ladies. She extended a gloved hand in a firm handshake that surprised him with its strength and confidence. "Rebecca Stone," she said, her voice carrying traces of Eastern education beneath its measured tones. "And I believe you've just made the wisest investment in Millfield's agricultural future." Her eyes, visible through the mask's openings, sparkled with intelligence and something that might have been amusement at his obvious nervousness. As they walked toward his wagon, Rebecca explained that she would need to examine his land, soil composition, and remaining resources before proposing solutions. Her questions were specific and knowledgeable. When had he last rotated crops? What varieties of corn had he planted? How did he manage soil nutrients between growing seasons? Don found himself both intimidated and impressed by her obvious expertise, wondering what circumstances had brought such an educated woman to their frontier community. The afternoon sun slanted across her profile as she spoke, and he caught glimpses of auburn hair escaping from beneath her bonnet. The ride back to Dan's farm passed in conversation that revealed Rebecca's extensive knowledge of agricultural science and her mysterious background. She spoke of crop rotation methods developed at Cornell University, natural pest deterrent techniques, and soil restoration practices that sounded almost magical to a man who'd learned farming from his father's traditional methods. When Dawn asked directly about her identity and training, she deflected with gentle humor. "Let's say I've had unconventional opportunities for education, Mr. Forster, and leave the mystery for now." Her laugh was musical and genuine, carrying a warmth that made Dan forget, temporarily, about his ruined crops and mounting debts. Standing in the middle of his devastated fields as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Dan watched Rebecca kneel and examined the soil with the reverence of a scientist and the tenderness of a gardener. She removed her gloves to run the earth through her fingers, testing its texture and moisture content with practiced expertise. "This land isn't ruined, Daniel," she said, using his first name with easy familiarity. "It's just waiting for someone who understands what it needs." As she outlined her plan for soil restoration, companion planting, and natural pest management, Don realized that his $2 gamble had brought him into a world where farming was elevated from mere survival to sophisticated science. The special world was one where a masked woman held the keys to agricultural salvation. And Daniel Foster was about to discover that his education in impossible things had only just begun. The next morning arrived with Rebecca at Dan's door before sunrise, carrying a leather satchel filled with seed samples, soil testing equipment, and notebooks covered in detailed sketches and calculations. She'd traded her formal dress for practical work clothes, a divided skirt that allowed for movement, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across her still-masked face. "The first step," she explained while setting up her equipment, "is understanding what we're working with." Dan watched in fascination as she conducted tests he'd never seen before, measuring soil acidity with strips of treated paper and examining earth samples through a small magnifying glass. As they worked side by side throughout the morning, Don found himself stealing glances at his mysterious helper, trying to reconcile her obvious refinement with her willingness to dig in Nebraska dirt. Rebecca moved through his fields with the confidence of someone accustomed to outdoor labor, yet her hands, though capable, showed signs of a more genteel past. When she paused to sketch the layout of his property, her drawings revealed an artist's eye for detail and proportion. The contradiction fascinated him, a lady of evident education and breeding, who worked like a seasoned farmhand and spoke of crop rotation with the passion other women reserved for music or literature. By midday, Rebecca had diagnosed the problems with Dan's farming methods and outlined a comprehensive recovery plan that would take 2 growing seasons to fully implement. She spread her notebooks across his kitchen table, explaining how the previous year's monoculture corn planting had depleted specific nutrients that the locusts' destruction had made irreplaceable through normal methods. "We'll plant winter wheat mixed with legumes to restore nitrogen," she said, her finger tracing patterns on her detailed soil map, followed by oats in early spring, then summer vegetables in companion plantings that naturally repel the insects that attract locusts. Don listened with growing amazement, realizing that this woman understood his land better after one morning than he had after 5 years. That afternoon, as they walked to the general store to purchase seeds and supplies, Dawn became aware of the attention Rebecca drew from the townspeople. Her mask made her a figure of intense curiosity and speculation, but she handled the stares and whispered questions with gracious deflection and polite conversation about agricultural matters. Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, tried repeatedly to engage her in gossip about local families. But Rebecca redirected every conversation back to farming techniques and community crop planning. Don found himself oddly proud to be seen with this intriguing woman, even as he wondered what secrets lay behind her elegant disguise. The seed selection process revealed more of Rebecca's extensive knowledge as she examined varieties with the expertise of a professional agriculturalist. She rejected Dan's usual choices in favor of heritage grains and vegetables, selected for their soil-building properties and natural pest resistance. These seeds cost more initially, she explained, while counting out portions into small cloth bags, but they'll save money and labor in the long run. As Don watched her weigh and package their purchases, he noticed the gentle precision of her movements and the way she handled each seed variety with almost reverent care, as if she understood their potential in ways that transcended mere commerce. Evening, as they sat on Dan's porch, sharing a simple supper of bread and stew, Rebecca removed her mask for the first time to eat, revealing a face of striking intelligence and unexpected beauty. Her features were refined but strong, with high cheekbones, expressive green eyes, and the kind of determined jaw that suggested a woman accustomed to making her own decisions. Don felt something shift in his chest, not just attraction to her physical beauty, but a deeper recognition of kindred spirit. When she caught him staring and smiled with gentle amusement rather than embarrassment, he knew that his investment in her agricultural services had become something far more precious and personal. The planting began at dawn the next day, with Rebecca directing operations with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. She'd sketched detailed planting diagrams that divided Dan's fields into sections based on soil composition, drainage, and sun exposure, creating an intricate pattern that looked almost like a work of art from the farmhouse porch. Don followed her instructions precisely, though the methods seemed strange after years of traditional ROA planting. Agriculture is a science, Rebecca reminded him as they worked, but it's also an art that requires understanding the unique personality of each piece of land. As word of Rebecca's agricultural expertise spread through Millfield, neighbors began arriving at Dan's farm seeking advice for their own crop problems. She welcomed each visitor with patient attention, offering specific solutions for everything, from soil erosion to pest management to crop storage techniques. Dan watched in amazement as his mysterious helper transformed from his personal salvation into the community's agricultural consultant, sharing knowledge that could revolutionize farming practices throughout the county. Her generosity with her expertise and her refusal to accept payment for additional consultations earned her the respect and affection of people who had initially viewed her with suspicion. The questions about Rebecca's identity intensified as her impact on local farming became more pronounced, but she continued to deflect inquiries with humor and redirection. When pressed directly about her background during a community meeting at the church, she simply said, "I've been blessed with educational opportunities that I'm now privileged to share with this wonderful community." Dan found himself becoming protective of her privacy, quietly discouraging speculation and gossip, while marveling at her ability to remain mysterious without seeming secretive or deceptive. 3 weeks into their partnership, Don realized that his feelings for Rebecca had evolved far beyond gratitude or professional admiration. He found himself watching for her arrival each morning, treasuring their conversations over shared meals, and feeling genuinely interested in her thoughts on subjects ranging from agricultural science to literature to the social changes sweeping across America. She spoke knowledgeably about women's education, scientific advancement, and social reform with the passion of someone personally invested in progress. Yet she never revealed specific details about her own involvement in these movements. The evening, Rebecca stayed for dinner after a particularly long day of soil preparation. Dan gathered the courage to ask direct questions about her past and future plans. They sat by lamplight in his simple kitchen, sharing a meal of fresh bread and vegetables from his emergency garden. When he asked if she intended to remain in Millfield permanently, her pause was long and thoughtful before she answered, "That depends on whether this community has room for a woman with unconventional ideas and an uncommon background." The vulnerability in her voice surprised him. revealing that beneath her confident expertise lay uncertainty about her place in this traditional frontier society. As October progressed and the first plantings began to show promising growth, confidence in Rebecca's methods grew along with his attraction to the woman herself. The small shoots of winter wheat emerged in neat rows that followed the contour of his land rather than fighting against it, and the companion plantings of clover and alfalfa already showed signs of enriching the soil. More importantly, he noticed that Rebecca had begun to relax around him, laughing more freely, sharing opinions on topics beyond agriculture, and occasionally forgetting to maintain the formal distance she kept with other community members. First serious challenge to their growing partnership came when County Agricultural Agent Samuel Morrison arrived unannounced to investigate reports of unconventional farming practices and a suspicious woman giving unauthorized agricultural advice. Morrison, a pompous man who viewed scientific farming methods as Eastern foolishness unsuitable for practical Nebraska farmers, inspected Dan's fields with obvious skepticism and barely concealed hostility toward Rebecca's innovations. His questions were pointed and accusatory. What qualifications does this masked woman have to advise our farmers? Are these experimental methods proven safe for our climate and conditions? The threat was clear. Official interference could end Rebecca's work and Dan's hopes for agricultural recovery. Rebecca met Morrison's challenge with calm professionalism, producing documentation of her methods, explaining the scientific principles behind each technique, and offering to submit soil samples for official testing to prove the effectiveness of her restoration plan. Dawn watched with admiration as she transformed from mysterious helper to authoritative expert, speaking Morrison's bureaucratic language while maintaining her essential mystery about her personal credentials. Her confidence never wavered, even when Morrison demanded to know her educational background and professional references. Questions she deflected by focusing on results rather than credentials. The confrontation with Morrison revealed to Dawn the precarious nature of Rebecca's position in their community, a woman whose knowledge and capabilities exceeded those of the official experts, but whose unconventional status made her vulnerable to official interference. That evening, as they sat in his kitchen discussing Morrison's visit, Dawn realized that protecting Rebecca had become as important to him as saving his farm. "You don't have to prove anything to men like Morrison," he told her, surprised by the intensity of his own feelings. "But if you need someone to stand up for you, I'm ready to do that." Rebecca's response to his offer of protection revealed more of her true character than all their weeks of working together. She reached across the table to take his hand, her touch warm and grateful. But her words were those of a woman accustomed to fighting her own battles. "Daniel, your faith in me means more than you know. But I've learned that a woman must prove her worth through her work, not through the men who defend her." The strength in her voice was matched by a softness in her eyes that suggested his support was more valuable to her than professional recognition or official approval. As autumn deepened and the success of Rebecca's initial plantings became undeniable, Dan found himself imagining a future that extended far beyond agricultural recovery. The way she moved through his kitchen as if it were her own, her easy conversation with his neighbors, her obvious love for the work they shared all suggested possibilities he'd never dared consider. When she stayed late one evening to help him plan the following year's crop rotation, Don realized that somewhere between soil testing and seed planting, he'd fallen completely in love with his mysterious agricultural consultant. The revelation of Rebecca's true identity came unexpectedly when Pastor Henderson arrived with a letter addressed to Miss Rebecca Stone, formerly of Cornell University Agricultural College. The envelope bore the official seal of the New York State Agricultural Department, and Rebecca's face went pale as she recognized the handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and read aloud, "Miss Stone, your research on sustainable farming methods has been accepted for publication in the American Agricultural Journal, and we formally offer you the position of Regional Agricultural Consultant for the Western Territory." Dan watched her struggle with emotions he couldn't identify, realizing that his $2 investment had purchased the services of one of the most qualified agricultural scientists in America. Woman whose expertise could take her anywhere, but who had chosen to save his small Nebraska farm. The letter's arrival forced Rebecca to reveal her complete story, how she'd graduated from Cornell with honors in agricultural science, worked as a researcher for the agricultural department, and fled to Nebraska after a scandal involving her refusal to accept credit for her research being given to male colleagues. "I came here to disappear," she admitted, tears streaking down her face as she finally removed her mask completely. But I found something I never expected to find: the vulnerability of her confession, combined with the professional recognition the letter represented, created a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Success that threatened to separate them just as they'd discovered their feelings for each other. Dan's initial reaction to learning Rebecca's true credentials was a mixture of awe, inadequacy, and desperate fear of losing her. How could a simple Nebraska farmer hope to compete with prestigious positions and professional recognition? But as he watched her struggle with the decision, he realized that her choice wasn't between him and career advancement. It was between the recognition she deserved and the life she'd chosen to build in Millfield. "You don't have to choose between your calling and your happiness," he told her that evening as they walked through the fields, showing the first signs of her restoration work. The community's reaction to news of Rebecca's qualifications was a mixture of pride, amazement, and concern about losing their agricultural savior to bigger opportunities. Mrs. Patterson organized a meeting at the church to discuss keeping our agricultural expert in Millfield, while the farmers whose crops Rebecca had helped began planning a formal petition to the county agricultural department, requesting her appointment as their official consultant. Dan watched with growing pride as his neighbors rallied to support the woman who had transformed their agricultural prospects. But he also recognized the pressure this created for Rebecca to make a decision about her future. The crisis reached its peak when Samuel Morrison returned with county officials demanding that Rebecca either present proper credentials for her agricultural work or cease all consultation activities immediately. The confrontation took place in front of half the town, with Morrison's bureaucratic authority pitted against the community's passionate defense of Rebecca's proven results. Dan watched Rebecca stand alone before the officials, her composure perfect but her hands trembling slightly as she was forced to choose between revealing her complete professional background or accepting banishment from the work that had become her passion. The moment stretched endlessly as the entire future of their partnership, professional and personal, balanced on her next words. Rebecca's voice rang clear and strong across the assembled crowd as she made her choice to stand and fight rather than flee or hide. "Gentlemen," she addressed the county officials with the authority of her educational background and professional accomplishments. "I am Rebecca Stone, graduate of Cornell University's Agricultural College, former researcher for the New York State Agricultural Department, and currently the most qualified agricultural scientist within 500 miles of Millfield." The gasps from the crowd were audible as she produced her official credentials, documentation of her published research, and letters of recommendation from some of the most respected names in American agricultural science. Morrison's face went red as his authority crumbled before superior expertise and unquestionable qualifications. The transformation in the community's perception was immediate and complete. Rebecca Stone was no longer the mysterious masked woman who'd helped one desperate farmer, but a renowned expert who'd chosen their small town as her home. The county officials found themselves in the awkward position of trying to restrict someone whose qualifications far exceeded their own, while the townspeople beamed with pride at having attracted such distinguished expertise to their community. Dawn watched with amazement as Rebecca seamlessly shifted from defensive mystery to authoritative professional, handling questions about agricultural policy and scientific methodology with the confidence of someone accustomed to academic and governmental recognition. But the true test came when the officials, somewhat grudgingly, offered Rebecca the formal position of county agricultural consultant, a prestigious appointment that would require her to travel throughout the territory, serving multiple communities, rather than focusing on MILF-specific needs. Dan's heart sank as he realized this was exactly the kind of opportunity that could take her away from the life they'd begun to build together. The offer represented everything she'd sacrificed by coming to Nebraska in disguised professional recognition, substantial salary, and the chance to impact agricultural development across the entire Western Territory. Rebecca's response surprised everyone, including Dan. She thanked the officials for their recognition but declined the county position, instead proposing to establish Millfield as a model community for sustainable agricultural practices, where farmers from across the region could come to learn and observe successful implementation of scientific farming methods. "This community gave me a chance when I needed one most," she said, her eyes finding Dan's in the crowd. "And I believe the best way to serve agricultural development is to prove that these methods work in a real farming community." with real farmers facing real challenges. Her proposal transformed rejection into innovation, turning down prestigious appointment in favor of creating something entirely new. The final confrontation came when Morrison, humiliated by Rebecca's superior qualifications and frustrated by her rejection of official position, accused her of abandoning professional responsibility for romantic attachment to a local farmer. The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Don felt his anger rise as Morrison questioned both Rebecca's professional judgment and their personal relationship. But before Don could respond, Rebecca stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced worse challenges than a petty bureaucrat's wounded pride. "Mr. Morrison," she said with cold precision, "my personal choices are guided by the same scientific rigor as my professional decisions. I've studied the conditions, evaluated the variables, and concluded that this community offers the optimal environment for the work I'm meant to do." Her defense of their relationship as a rational choice rather than romantic follies silenced Morrison's objections while affirming her commitment to both her calling and her chosen home. With the official challenges resolved and Rebecca's status in the community secure, Dan finally found the courage to address their personal future directly. That evening, as they walked through fields showing the first clear signs of successful restoration, he stopped beside the small grove of oak trees that bordered his property and took her hands in his. "Rebecca," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I need to know if your scientific evaluation of optimal conditions includes the possibility of marriage to a Nebraska farmer who's grateful for your expertise but loves you for who you are, not what you know." Her laughter was soft and joyful as she admitted that her analysis had indeed indicated that marriage to Daniel Foster would provide the perfect foundation for both personal happiness and professional fulfillment. The proposal was accepted with the same thoughtful consideration Rebecca brought to all her decisions, but her joy was unmistakable as she said yes to becoming Mrs. Daniel Foster. They set the wedding date for the following spring, after the success of her agricultural restoration plan could be fully demonstrated and their partnership, both professional and personal, would be founded on proven results. The engagement was celebrated by the entire community, who saw their union as a symbol of Millfield's transformation from struggling farming community to model of agricultural innovation and scientific progress. The spring wedding took place in Pastor Henderson's church, decorated with flowers from Rebecca's experimental garden and attended by farmers from across the county, who'd come to learn from the couple that had revolutionized local agriculture. Rebecca wore her grandmother's wedding dress, finally abandoning the mask that had once concealed her identity, while Dan stood proud in a new suit purchased with profits from his first successful harvest in 3 years. The ceremony celebrated not just their personal commitment but the community's embrace of both scientific progress and traditional values, proving that innovation and heritage could flourish together in the rich soil of mutual respect and shared purpose. A year after their wedding, Dan and Rebecca's farm had become a destination for agricultural students, government officials, and farmers seeking to implement sustainable practices on their own land. Rebecca had published articles about their methods in national journals, while Don had evolved from desperate farmer to knowledgeable partner in their innovative enterprise. Their success had attracted attention from universities and agricultural departments across the country, but they remained committed to their chosen home and the community that had supported their unlikely partnership. The farmhouse, expanded to accommodate visiting researchers and agricultural students, buzzed with activity while maintaining the warmth of a true home. The transformation extended beyond their personal happiness to encompass the entire Millfield community, which had become renowned throughout Nebraska for its progressive agricultural practices and remarkable crop yields. The same fields that had been devastated by locusts now produced harvests that exceeded pre-disaster levels, while the soil improvement techniques Rebecca had introduced ensured long-term sustainability rather than short-term gains. Dan often stood in those fields at sunset, marveling at how a $2 gamble on a masked woman's promise had led to prosperity beyond his wildest dreams, not just financial success, but a partnership that combined love, shared purpose, and mutual respect for each other's contributions to their common goals. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the students had returned to their own communities, Dan and Rebecca would sit on their expanded porch, watching the sun set over fields that testified to the power of knowledge, courage, and faith in unexpected possibilities. Rebecca would sometimes trace the lines of Dan's weathered hands, marveling at how those same hands that had once scattered seeds in desperation now worked with the precision of someone who understood that farming was both art and science. The story had become part of Millfield's folklore, the lonely rancher, who paid $2 for a masked woman at a community auction and found not just agricultural salvation, but a love story that proved the best investments are made, not in certainty, but in hope for what might be possible when two people choose to build something beautiful together.